Hello everyone, Professor Kruzlik here. So I wanted to make a video responding back to a question I received on a previous video that I made, the video about when liberal internationalism and interconnectivity fails to stop conflict. So the question was asked, does liberal internationalism, does being more interconnected ever work? And I made a video about the European coal and steel community, but I wanted to make another one with a couple examples of where scholars point to as liberal internationalism being successful. So we know the scholarship is very, it's complicated. Some scholars say no, some scholars say yes. As with many social science questions, there is not a simple, well, this always works or this never works. So it is a fair question to ask whether liberal internationalism has worked. It is one thing to say that institutions and trade and democracy and interdependence can encourage cooperation, which in our video on liberal internationalism, that's kind of what we walked through, what these scholars say. However, it is another thing to show, to empirically show that this has happened in practice. So many scholars, like I've pointed out in other videos, say yes, this has happened, but with qualifications. They argue that liberal internationalism has not worked everywhere. It has not eliminated war. It has not made power politics simply disappear. But many scholars point out that there are several important cases where liberal ideas about institutions and interdependence help produce real political success. The first major example is Western Europe after World War II. After 1945, the United States and its allies built a new world order, a new economic order to try to fix the destruction that the war had brought about through security cooperation and, of course, institutions. And this is what we have learned about in our history courses as the Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild Western Europe. NATO gave Western European states a security guarantee. The Bretton Woods institutions helped stabilize the global economy. The GATT system created rules of trade. And so over time, European states also began creating regional institutions that eventually developed into the European Union. So liberal institutionalists, liberal institutional scholars point to all of these things: the Marshall Plan, NATO, the GATT, eventually the European Union, as success stories. So we see a new order built around economic recovery, security cooperation, and international institutions as a way to try to prevent what happened in the Second World War from happening again. So this is one of the strongest liberal internationalist success stories that they point to, because it shows that those institutions can make cooperation more durable. The United States was powerful, but it did not simply dominate Western Europe through coercion. It embedded its power in alliances, again, institutions, and roles. So political scientists like John Eikenberry make this argument through after victory, after major wars. And he argues that powerful states can create more stable orders when they restrain and organize their power through institutions. So this does not mean that power simply disappears. The post-war liberal order depended heavily on American power, but that power was made more predictable because of the institutions that were being created. Other states could cooperate with the United States because they had some confidence that American leadership would operate through roles and alliances and repeated bargaining rather than through pure domination. So in a previous video, we also talked about the Franco-German reconciliation after the Second World War. But just to touch on it here, because this is another example where scholars point to. Some scholars say this actually might be the cleanest and clearest example of interdependence working as a peace-building strategy. So we know that France and Germany had fought repeated wars, including the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, World War II. So for much of modern European history, conflict between France and Germany was one of the central sources of destabilization on the continent of Europe. So after the Second World War, European leaders tried to change that relationship. The key early institution was the European coal and steel community. Again, I made a whole video on this, but it's worth touching on here because scholars point to this as a success story. Coal and steel were essential materials for industrial production and war making. By placing these sectors under a shared authority, France, West Germany, several other European states made future war among themselves materially harder and politically less likely. So this was not simply about trade. It was institutionalized interdependence. The goal was not just to increase commerce and hope that peace would follow. The goal was to change the structure of incentives. If the industries necessary for war were jointly managed, then preparing for war again against one another became much more difficult. So again, scholars point to this, including Ernest Haas, who is the one of the key authors here. In his book, The Uniting of Europe, Haas argued that cooperation in one area could create pressure for cooperation in others. This is the idea that he brings up of spillover. States might begin with technical cooperation over coal and steel, but that cooperation could gradually expand into trade, agriculture, regulation, courts, borders, and eventually maybe even into broader political integration. So the long-term outcome is historically significant. War between France and Germany is now almost unthinkable. That is not a small achievement. A relationship once defined and dominated by military rivalry became embedded in institutions, economic ties, shared governance. We see a lot of discussion today about Germany rearming and the Americans pressuring Germany to take a bigger role in European defense. This is unthinkable 20, 30 years ago. If Germany would have said they were going to rearm, this would have thrown up red flags. But due to these institutions growing and supporting each other, we have seen a celebration almost of Germany spending more on defense. So, okay, a third example that scholars like to point to is the European Union itself as a broader security community, a broader integration community. We've seen are authors arguing and using the term security community to describe something like the European Union. This doesn't mean that these states can never go to war, but that they are there for each other. So when we look at the European Union and we look at what liberal internationalists argue, they argue that the EU did not simply abolish politics, but it did change the form that politics takes. Disputes that might once have been settled through coercion or maybe even war are now handled through negotiation, courts, elections, summits, and bureaucratic bargaining. So we see here that scholars say liberalism's contribution here is clear. That through the European Union, this integration has created an atmosphere where European states can cooperate and work together to find solutions to their differences. So when we think for students, what the main takeaway here is that liberal internationalism is not a theory that points to automatic peace. It is a theory of conditional cooperation. It argues that states can sometimes reduce conflict and can solve common problems when institutions, interdependence, domestic support, and power align. So through 3 case studies, we see where scholars have pointed out liberal internationalism actually helping rebuild Europe after the Second World War. Allow countries to cooperate that had been at war for on and off for a century. And with the European Union, when states come together to work to find solutions to their differences. So these are all case studies that we could dig into. There's a ton of scholarship and a ton of literature. But just here at our 30,000-foot level, we can see where some scholars argue liberal internationalism has been a success. Thank you.